All things are poison, and nothing is without poison. The dosage alone makes it so a thing is not a poison. The principle of the dose makes the poison forms the cornerstone of modern toxicology and pharmacology. For instance, as covered in our previous video, how poison gas saved millions of lives, the first anti-cancer chemotherapy drugs were derived from chemical weapons used to kill thousands during the First World War, while the most seemingly benign substance on Earth, ordinary water, can be deadly if consumed in large quantities, causing a severe electrolyte imbalance and cardiac arrest. The Paracelsus principle also applies to ionizing radiation, which in large amounts can cause cancer, severe burns, or an agonizing death from radiation poisoning, but in smaller, more controlled doses can shrink or eliminate tumors and diagnose various diseases. But unlike most poisons, ionizing radiation is invisible and has no taste or smell, making it disturbingly easy to absorb a fatal dose without even realizing it. For this reason, the radioisotopes used in nuclear medicine must be closely monitored and controlled by the proper authorities. When these controls fail, and these substances wind up in the hands of unsuspecting members of the public, the results can be disastrous. Such was the case in September 1987 when contamination from a stolen radioactive source killed 4 and injured dozens of others in a small Brazilian city. This is the tragic story of the Goiânia incident. So our story begins in 1985 at the Instituto Goiânia de Radioterapia, or IGR, a private radiotherapy clinic located in the city of Goiânia, around 100 kilometers southwest of the Brazilian capital of Brasilia. Founded in 1971, the clinic operated 2 teletherapy machines which produced beams of high-energy gamma rays for use in treating cancer. One machine used the isotope cobalt-60 as its gamma source, while the other used cesium-137. In late 1985, IGR relocated to new premises, taking the cobalt-60 machine but leaving the now outdated cesium-137 unit behind. However, the clinic failed to inform the National Nuclear Energy Commission, or CNEN, Brazil's main nuclear regulatory body, about the abandoned machine as required by its nuclear licensing agreement. At the same time, the former clinic site became the subject of a legal battle between IGR and the Society of St. Vincent de Paul, a Catholic charitable organization who claimed ownership of the property. As this dispute raged on, most of the clinic buildings and many surrounding structures were demolished and the site abandoned, leaving the machine and its highly radioactive cesium-137 source vulnerable to vandalism and theft. This risk was especially acute due to the clinic's location in the impoverished Aeroporto neighborhood of Goiânia, where scrap metal scavenging was rampant. On May 4, 1987, Carlos Figueira Bezerri, one of the owners of IGR, attempted to remove the machine from the site, but was blocked by police officers acting on the orders of the Social Security Institute for Civil Servants, or IPASCO. In the wake of this incident, Figueiro and other IGR board members wrote to IPASCO and CNEN, warning them of what might happen if the cesium bomb fell into the wrong hands. But these agencies largely ignored these warnings, posting only a single security guard to monitor the former clinic site. The inevitable finally happened on September 10, 1987, when the government-appointed guard failed to show up, allowing 2 illegal scrap metal scavengers, Roberto dos Santos Alves and Wagner Mota Pereira, to sneak onto the former clinic site. Picking through the still intact treatment rooms, they soon stumbled upon the abandoned teletherapy unit. The unit in question was a Genere SPA Cesapan F3000, manufactured by Barazzetti & Company of Milan, Italy, and purchased by IGR in 1977. The machine featured a radiation head that could slide along a vertical track and rotate about a further 2 axes, allowing the gamma ray beam to be accurately aimed at a patient's body. The beam itself was generated by a 74 terabecquerel or 2000 curie cesium-137 source manufactured at Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. 1 becquerel, named after the French scientist Henri Becquerel, the discoverer of radioactivity, is equivalent to 1 radioactive decay per second, while a curie, named after fellow radiation pioneers Marie and Pierre Curie, is equivalent to 3.7 times 10 to the power of 10 becquerels. By comparison, the americium-241 radioactive source found in most household smoke detectors produces only 37 kilobecquerels, or 1 microcurie of radiation, 2 billion times less than the Goiânia source. Americium-241 also emits relatively harmless alpha particles, as opposed to the far more penetrating and dangerous beta particles and gamma rays produced by cesium-137. By the time of the accident, the source, which had a half-life of 30 years, had decayed to 50.9 terabecquerels, or 1,375 curies. Still, at 1 meter from the source, the radioactive dose rate was still a whopping 4.56 grays per hour. As we've explained in greater detail in our previous video, how much radiation can the human body take and are dental x-rays safe, the effects of radiation on the human body are very complicated and depend on various factors, including type of radiation and the specific body tissues exposed to it. Very briefly, however, correcting the total radiation dose in grays for these factors yields an absorbed dose in sieverts, and the LD50/30 for ionizing radiation, that is, the dose needed to kill a human 50% of the time within 30 days, is around 4 to 5 sieverts. Thus, it would have taken only an hour of exposure to the Goiânia radioactive source to absorb a fatal radiation dose. But Alves and Pereira were completely ignorant of the danger, and over the next 3 days they proceeded to partially dismantle the machine and load the radioactive source assembly into a wheelbarrow, hoping it might have some scrap metal value. The cesium-137, in the form of the salt cesium chloride, was contained in a stainless steel cylinder called an International Standard Capsule, measuring 48mm long and 51mm in diameter. This capsule sat inside a large mass of lead shielding inside the radiation head and could be rotated by an electric motor into one of two positions: storage and irradiation. In the former position, an aperture in the capsule faced the shielding, preventing the radiation from escaping, while in the latter it lined up with a collimator channel which focused the gamma rays into a tight beam. As soon as Alves and Pereira removed the source capsule from its shielding, they started being directly exposed to its gamma beam. On September 13th, the pair transported the capsule to Alves' home on Rua 57, around half a kilometer from the clinic site. Later that evening, both men began feeling ill and vomiting. The next day, Pereira felt dizzy and started suffering from diarrhea, while his right hand swelled up and developed a severe burn, the exact shape and size of the capsule aperture. On September the 15th, Pereira visited a medical clinic, but his symptoms were attributed to food poisoning or an allergic reaction, and he was instructed to stay home for a week and do only light work. Meanwhile, Alves, working under a mango tree in his garden, continued trying to disassemble the source assembly. In the process, he punctured the capsule with a screwdriver, releasing some of the black cesium chloride powder inside. Thinking it might be some kind of gunpowder, Alves tried to light the powder with a match, but it failed to ignite. On September the 18th, Alves succeeded in extracting the source capsule and took the radiation head to Dever Alves Ferreira, owner of a nearby scrapyard. As Ferreira later recalled, quote, "Around 10 o'clock in the morning, a young man appeared whom I did not know in the junkyard. He offered me a piece of lead that should weigh between 80 and 100 pounds. I said I needed documents because of the large amount of material. He agreed and said that in the afternoon he would bring the documents. At about 5 p.m, he appeared and asked for a borrowed wheelbarrow and an employee of mine to help him carry the item. I weighed the lead and gave 98 pounds. There was another piece too with a stainless steel cap, which looked like a cheese with a little hole in the side. Ferreira bought the lot for the equivalent of $25, but seeing no value in the stainless steel capsule, he left this in his warehouse. However, later that evening, he noted an otherworldly blue glow emanating from the punctured capsule. Suspecting that the glowing substance might be valuable or even supernatural, Ferreira took the capsule into his house on Rue 15A to show off to his family and friends. The cause of the glow is disputed, with most experts attributing it to gamma rays ionizing the surrounding air. Such ionization air glow is sometimes seen around particularly powerful radiation sources, such as the supercritical plutonium bomb core, which took the lives of Manhattan Project scientists Harry Daghlian and Louis Slotin in 1945 and 1946. And for more on these tragic accidents, please do check out our previous video, Tickling the Dragon's Tail, the horrible heart of a nuclear bomb. Another possibility is Cherenkov radiation, resulting from moisture becoming absorbed in the highly soluble cesium chloride. This eerie blue glow is caused by radiation traveling faster than the regular speed of light through water and is often seen in nuclear reactors. And for more on this, please do check out our previous video, Does Anything Radioactive Actually Glow Bright Green? Over the next few days, Ferreira continued removing glowing, rice-sized grains of cesium chloride from the source capsule and gifted them to his friends and family members. They were enthralled by the mysterious glowing substance, as Manuel Ramos, a technician at CNEN, later explained, quote, "They had no idea what it was. People saw the light of the cesium and thought it was a precious gem. Some of them smeared it on their bodies. One guy saw that it glowed in the dark and made a Z on his chest. He now has a burn in that shape." Among the recipients was Ferreira's brother Ivo, who took his sample to his house on Rua 6 and spread it out on the kitchen table, where he and his family later ate dinner and ingested some of the powder. Captivated by the blue glow, Ivo's 6-year-old daughter, Lidi, even spread the powder over her body like carnival glitter. On September the 21st, Dever Ferreira's wife, Maria Gabriela, began to feel ill, vomiting and suffering from diarrhea. She also visited a doctor, as with Wagner Pereira, who diagnosed her with food poisoning and sent her back home to rest. Maria's mother stayed at the house for 2 days to take care of her daughter before returning home, carrying a significant amount of contamination with her. Another recipient was Ernesto Salazar Fabiano, a friend of Roberto Alves, who placed his grain of cesium in the front pocket of his pants and planned to set it in a ring for his wife Dalva. However, when he too suddenly fell ill and developed a severe radiation burn on his thigh, he flushed the glowing substance down the toilet. Meanwhile, 2 of De Ferreira's employees at his scrapyard, Israel Batista dos Santos Admilson and Alves de Souza, continued to cut apart the radioactive source in order to extract the lead shielding, absorbing large radiation doses in the process. On September the 25th, Ferreira sold the disassembled source to a third scrapyard owner, while the owner of a scrapyard next to Ivo Ferreira's house dispatched employees to the former IGR clinic site to disassemble and recover the rest of the abandoned teletherapy machine. At the same time, Wagner Pereira's radiation burn became increasingly painful, and on September the 27th, he was admitted to Goiânia's Santa Maria Hospital. However, the burn was misdiagnosed as a symptom of some infectious disease, and Pereira was transferred to the city's Tropical Diseases Hospital. It was only until September the 28th, 2 weeks after Roberto Alves and Wagner Pereira stole the radioactive source, that De Ferreira's wife, Maria, finally made the connection between the strange piece of scrap metal and the large number of people suddenly falling ill around her. Together with Geraldo Guilherme da Silva, one of her husband's employees, she went to the third junkyard, placed the disassembled source capsule in a bag, and transported it by bus to the local office of Agência Nacional de Vigilância Sanitária, the Brazilian health regulatory agency, where she deposited on the desk of a doctor and declared that the contents of the bag were killing her family. The doctor immediately sent Maria and Geraldo to a nearby health center, where, and this should come as no surprise at this point, they were diagnosed with an infectious illness and transferred to the Tropical Diseases Hospital. Thankfully, however, one of the physicians at the hospital, one Dr. Alonso Montero, began to suspect that the strange skin lesions appearing on so many of the hospital's recent patients were actually caused by radiation, and he launched his own investigation. He contacted health physicist Walter Mendes Ferreira, no relation to De or Maria Ferreira, who on September the 29th acquired a scintillation radiation counter from the offices of the government nuclear agency Nucubras and made his way to the Vigilância Sanitária offices to examine Maria Ferreira's mysterious package. However, as he approached the office, he switched on the detector only for the indicator dial to jump plumb off the scale. Assuming the device was faulty, Ferreira returned to the Nucubras office to obtain a replacement. He arrived back at Vigilância Sanitária later that morning, only for the replacement detector to also jump off the scale. Realizing that he had, to put it mildly, a big problem on his hands, Ferreira quickly persuaded the occupants of the building to vacate the premises and called in the fire brigade to cordon off the building. It was also his timely intervention which prevented said fire brigade from disposing of the radioactive source by simply tossing it in a nearby river. Guyana's finest, everybody. From this point, events unfolded at a rapid pace. By the end of the day, all the relevant public agencies, including the police, fire brigade, CNEN, and the Tropical Diseases Hospital, had been apprised of the situation, and the Goiás State Secretary for Health had arranged for those most severely contaminated by the radioactive source to be quarantined in the city's Olympic soccer stadium. Initially, 22 people were sent to this temporary facility, though thousands more later arrived seeking medical examination and treatment. In total, some 112,000 people were actively monitored, of whom 249 were found to have detectable radioactive contamination. 120 were easily decontaminated by removing their clothes and scrubbing their bodies with soap and water. However, the remaining 129 were found to have worrying levels of internal contamination and were sent to local hospitals for treatment. Of the 22 most heavily contaminated patients, 14 were transferred to the Marcio Dias Naval Hospital in Rio de Janeiro for intensive treatment, while the remaining 6 were treated at the Goiânia General Hospital. In Rio, the patients were subjected to whole-body radiation counting to measure the amount of cesium-137 they'd absorbed, frequent blood, urine, and stool sampling, treatment for radiation burns, and chelation treatment using hexacyanoferrate or Prussian blue, which binds to cesium and helps expel it from the body via sweat, urine, and feces. And to learn more about the strange materials economics behind the full-body radiation counting, please do check out our previous video, The Bizarre Market for Battleship Steel. Meanwhile, the director of the emergency group of the Department of Nuclear Installations, or GEDIN, was placed in charge of the emergency response operations and began an extensive survey of the city using helicopter and automobile-mounted scintillation counters to determine the full extent of the radioactive contamination. Large numbers of rainwater, groundwater, and air samples were also collected. The survey uncovered 7 main areas of contamination over 67 square kilometers of the city, including the houses of Roberto Alves, Dever Ferreira, and Ivo Ferreira, the 3 scrapyards which had handled the stolen radioactive source, and the offices of Vigilancia Sanitaria, where Dr. PM had placed the dismantled source on a chair in the building's courtyard. Wind and rain further dispersed contamination more than 200 kilometers from its original source. Strangely, the former location of the IGR clinic, from which the cesium capsule was stolen, was not significantly contaminated, as the capsule was only breached after it was removed from the site. The property is today the site of the Goiânia Convention Center, built in 2000. Dozens of less contaminated sites were also found, including 42 houses, 3 buses, and 14 cars. Residents of areas with dose rates exceeding 2.5 microsieverts per hour were temporarily evacuated. As Julio Cesar, a student living near the home of Roberto Alves, told reporters at the time, quote, "The police woke us up at 3 a.m. on September the 29th and told us we had to leave because it was dangerous. We were thrown out onto the street, forced to move to a hotel, and weren't allowed to take anything with us, not even our clothes. The authorities say it is okay to stay here, but everyone is confused. Some people on the block are leaving, some people are staying. I don't know what I'll do." Once evacuated, the exterior surfaces of houses and vehicles were decontaminated by spraying them with organic solvents, sodium hydroxide solutions, and potassium alum dissolved in hydrochloric acid. Contamination at the 7 primary sites was measured as high as 2 sieverts per hour, forcing the authorities to demolish houses, remove the upper layer of topsoil, and cart these materials to a temporary disposal site just outside of the city. In total, some 3,500 cubic meters of contaminated material was removed and packed into 3,800 metal drums, 1,400 metal boxes, 10 shipping containers, and 6 concrete containers. As the remains of the radioactive source at the Vigilancia Sanitaria offices had remained in their shoulder bag and not spread contamination around the building, they were dealt with in a unique way. A crane was used to lower a section of steel drain pipe over the bag, and concrete poured into the pipe, encasing and shielding the source and allowing it to be removed and transported to the disposal site. The emptied remains of the radiation head were later seized by the Brazilian military and are now on display at the Escola de Instrução Especializada, or School of Specialized Instruction, in Rio de Janeiro. Thanks to a team of 550 workers toiling day and night, preliminary decontamination of the worst affected areas was completed by December 21, 1987, while the second remedial decontamination phase lasted until March 1988. The total cost of the cleanup? $20 million. According to the International Atomic Agency, or IAEA, of the 50.9 terabecquerels of cesium-137 in the source when it was stolen, 44 were recovered in the cleanup operation, meaning that around 7 terabecquerels remained in the environment, most of it dispersed and diluted by heavy rains during the decontamination process. As of this recording, that would have decayed to around 3.5 becquerels. But while these decontamination efforts succeeded in swiftly returning Goiânia to a state of normalcy, many of those who came into contact with the deadly radioactive source were not so lucky. Of the 22 most exposed patients transferred to Mauricio Dias Naval Hospital in Rio de Janeiro for intensive treatment, 4 died within a month of being admitted. Maria Gabriela Ferreira, the wife of scrapyard owner Dever Ferreira, received a total dose of 5.7 grays and developed acute radiation sickness, including hair loss, diarrhea, kidney failure, internal bleeding, and immune system collapse. She died of septicemia, aka blood poisoning, on October 23, 1987, at the age of just 37. Her 6-year-old niece, Leda, who had ingested a large quantity of the cesium chloride salt and painted it on her body, received a dose of 6 grays and deteriorated rapidly, suffering severe radiation burns to her mouth and throat and internal bleeding. She was so heavily contaminated that hospital staff quarantined her in an isolated room and refused to go near her. She died on the same day as her aunt and was buried in a special lead-lined fiberglass coffin. The final 2 victims were 18-year-old Edmilson Alves de Souza and 22-year-old Israel Batista dos Santos, employees of Dever Ferreira, who received radiation doses of 5.3 and 4.5 grays respectively, while cutting up the radioactive source to extract the lead shielding. Both developed severe internal bleeding as well as heart and lung damage, with dos Santos passing away on October 27, 1987, and de Souza the following day. Incredibly, despite receiving a massive dose of 7 grays, Dever Ferreira survived the incident, though he suffered from lifelong depression and took to binge drinking, dying in 1994 of cirrhosis of the liver. His brother Ivo also survived, dying of emphysema in 2003. Geraldo Guilherme da Silva, who had transported the radioactive source from the 3rd junkyard to the Vigilancia Sanitaria offices, absorbed a dose of 3 grays and suffered a severe radiation burn to his shoulder, but otherwise survived. Finally, the 2 men who stole the source suffered severe radiation burns, while Wagner Pereira having several fingers amputated and Roberto Alves his entire right forearm. Their ultimate fate is unknown. The remaining patients responded well to Prussian blue chelation therapy and were released as soon as their body burden of cesium had dropped to safe levels. But their future was far from certain, for the effects of chronic radiation exposure often do not manifest for many years. Indeed, over the 4 decades since the incident, rates of breast cancer in Guyana's airport neighborhood have doubled compared to the surrounding city. Worse still, many of the victims suffered prejudice and ostracism similar to that faced by the Hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Or when the family of 6-year-old Laida de Neves Ferreira went to bury her in Goiânia's public cemetery, more than 2,000 protesters blocked the cemetery gates and rioted, afraid that her body would contaminate the surrounding soil. Similar protests broke out following the government's announcement that the radioactive waste from the incident would be disposed of in the remote Para region, mainly by indigenous peoples who lived there. In 1995, civil and criminal suits were filed by the victims' families, the Federal Public Prosecution Service, and the State of Goiás Public Prosecution Service against various responsible organizations, including the National Nuclear Energy Commission, or CNEN, the State of Goiás Health Department, the Social Security Institute for Civil Servants, or IPASCO, and the owners and directors of the IGR clinic. While courts determined that the teletherapy unit had been purchased by IGR as a corporation and not by the individual doctors, they did find one of the owners and the clinic's physicist responsible for the derelict condition of the former hospital site and ordered them to pay a fine of 100,000 Brazilian real, around $24,000, for the derelict condition of the machine and the building housing it. IPASCO was ordered to pay an identical amount. The courts also determined that CNEN had been aware of the abandoned machine and failed to take appropriate action. Thus, on March 17, 2000, the commission was ordered to pay compensation of 1.3 million real, around $750,000, to the direct and indirect victims of the incident and their descendants to the 3rd generation. The International Atomic Energy Agency, or IAEA, ranks incidents involving radioactive material on the International Nuclear Event Scale. The scale has 8 levels, ranging from 0, a deviation, to 7, a major accident. The IAEA ranks the 1987 Goiânia incident at level 5, accident with wider consequences, just below accidents like the 1957 Kishtin disaster, the 1986 Chernobyl disaster, and the 2011 Fukushima disaster. And to learn more about the former nearly forgotten incident, please do check out our previous video, The Secret Chernobyl Before Chernobyl. Despite the authorities' swift and comprehensive response once the loss of the cesium source was discovered, the incident uncovered considerable negligence on the part of several government agencies who failed to recover and properly dispose of the abandoned teletherapy machine for 2 years before it was finally stolen. But the primary cause of the disaster was not administrative, but social. Roberto Alves, Wagner Pereira, and many of their friends and family were functionally illiterate and did not recognize the radiation trefoil symbol and other warnings on the abandoned equipment. They thus did not realize the danger until it was too late. Indeed, the IAEA report on the incident concludes, quote, "The accident in Goiânia shows how actions that would have been innocuous under ordinary circumstances become matters of life and death owing to the presence of radioactive material. This bears out a cardinal rule of radiological protection, namely that the security of the source is of paramount importance. Consideration should be given to markings for radiation hazards that would be recognizable to the wider public. The interest aroused by the blue glow of the radioactive cesium chloride source markedly influenced the course of the accident in Goiânia. Clear and recognizable marks on radiation sources should help to lessen the likelihood of accidental exposures." Enan Borges Moreira, a neighbor of Wagner Pereira, put it more succinctly, telling a reporter it was not their fault, they didn't know, but perhaps some blame must rest with our society, which allows a low class of people to scavenge in order to live. Sadly, such conditions are hardly unique to Brazil, nor is the Goiânia incident the only one of its kind. Indeed, there have been dozens of similar incidents involving the release of radioactive scrap metal, including in northern Taiwan in 1982, Ciudad Juarez in Mexico in 1983, Cadiz in Spain in 1998, and Samut Prakan in Thailand in 2000, 2 of which we've also covered in our previous videos, the widespread nuclear disaster everyone promptly forgot about, and the curious case of the widespread radioactive apartments. It is a disturbing truth of our technologically advanced yet socially unequal world that wherever grinding poverty, loose regulations, and radioactive material intersect, disaster is bound to follow.